months, 6 months, 7 months gestation, have an ultrasound done, and if the ultrasound reveals a little boy, they will celebrate. If the ultrasound reveals the genitalia of a little girl, they will have an abortion. Sex-selective abortion is on the rise in China today. But large families are rare. I was in China a few months ago, and I visited a number of villages. And in the ordinary villages, I say ordinary villages, I mean non-Catholic villages, children were rare. And those children you did see were predominantly boys. You would go in a rural classroom and you would see, out of 30 kids, there would be 20 or more boys and a handful of girls. And you knew what had happened to the little girls. But then I visited Catholic villages. Not villages where Catholics were in the minority, but where villages where Catholics were not only in the majority, but constituted almost 100% of the population. In fact, they were so much in the majority that the village chief would be a Catholic, and the village head of the Communist Party apparatus would also be. So they had control of the village government. And in those villages, I saw lots of children, boys and girls. The head of the parish council in one village, who happened to also be the head of the village, imagine that, had 7 children. I said, how did you manage that? He said, well, when the population control police come to our village, we hide our pregnant women. We see them coming, and they go to the ground. And so the population control authorities, who, if they found them, would arrest them for the crime of being pregnant and would take them away and abort them, whether they wanted an abortion or not. Of course, they wouldn't want it. And then probably sterilize them. The population control police couldn't get their hands on them. And his oldest girl, in fact, just a few weeks after I was there, was scheduled to take her final vows in a religious order. So, there are exceptions to the one-child policy. Where Catholics are in a minority, they can't protect each other that way because their neighbors, their secular neighbors, will often inform on them. So it's harder for them to get away with breaking the policy. But right now in China, large families are becoming rare. The Chinese are only averaging about 1.7 children, 1 in the cities and 1 to 2 in the countryside. As I mentioned, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan are dying. South Korea and Taiwan were the original guinea pigs for US-funded population control programs. These programs go back to the early 1960s when the United States had first gotten into the business of telling families in different countries how many children they should or shouldn't have. Why South Korea and Taiwan? Well, South Korea and Taiwan were both at the time facing serious military threats, South Korea from the north, and Taiwan, of course, from the People's Republic of China. And so those governments were inclined to do what we asked them to do. We in the United States asked them to do. And what we asked them to do in the early 1960s was control their population growth, because our aid agency had fallen under the sway of the myth of overpopulation and believed that the way to development in Taiwan and South Korea was to force down the birth rate dramatically. That is, they were going to eliminate poverty by eliminating the poor and their children. Now, that never worked. But it was accepted by the governments of South Korea and Taiwan. They had a 2-child policy in both of those countries, never as viciously enforced as in China. But still, when I was doing research in a Taiwanese village, there were women, population control workers who came around and were distributing IUDs, encouraging women to get sterilized, and there was a propaganda campaign showing the perfect family of a father and mother and 2 children. Well now, flash forward to 2010. What do we have in both of those countries? We have an absolute shortage of workers. We have a birth rate that is not only at replacement of 2.1 children, but is down at about 1 child per couple. And we have governments that are now desperate to encourage young couples to marry and have children. Why didn't they leave well enough alone in the first place? Well, because we, the all-knowing United States, told them that they needed to reduce their birth rate. Now they're up against a rock here, facing a demographic cliff which they are about to fall over. And the cliff has many names. One of the names that it has, Father mentioned earlier, he mentioned Greece. You have lots of elderly people in Greece and very few young people. And so you have a social welfare state that can no longer sustain itself because you have too many people taking from these government programs and too few people paying in. Taiwan and South Korea are about to go over that same demographic cliff. All because the population control movement made guinea pigs out of those nations. The rest of Asia will soon follow. I hope that the Philippines is an exception to that. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I just wanted to show you total fertility in certain countries around the world. I put the Philippines up at the top to the left. Now, there are a lot of people who think that the birth rate in the Philippines is too high. But look at this total fertility rate. The total fertility rate is the number of children born to the average woman. The total fertility rate in the Philippines is now 2.23. What you need to replace the current population is 2.1. Where you have fairly high rates of infant child mortality, you need more. You need 2.2, 2.3, 2.5, 2.7. But let's say 2.1 in the Philippines would be replacement. 2.2 is almost at replacement already. Why this continued frenetic effort on the part of the UN Population Fund and USAID to focus on the Philippines, to try to impose a two-child policy on the Philippines of the kind that's already failed in Taiwan and in South Korea? Then we go to Latin America. A lot of people in the United States historically were concerned about high birth rates in Latin America, Catholic Latin America. And it is true that back in 1960, the average Mexican senora had 6 children. Today, she has 2. Colombia, 2.2. Brazil, 2.25. Ecuador, a little higher, 2.58. Peru, below replacement, 2.16. Costa Rica, below replacement, 2.1. Latin America is at or below replacement right now, closing in. Germany, an example from Europe, 1.36 children. Italy, 1.1. Now, I go to Rome from time to time. I like the Italian people, but if they don't start having children, there won't be any in a century or two. There are now 68 million Italians. There will be half that number at the end of the century if they do not start having children. China, 1.73. The US, 2 children. Turkey, 2.14. Turkey, of course, is an Islamic country. And the Islamic world is very mixed. There are some countries in the Islamic world with very high fertility, like Saudi Arabia, where women are kept at home and are not allowed to go out on the street by themselves without a male escort. But there are others, like Turkey, like Tunisia, Libya, where the birth rate is at replacement. And then we come to Africa. Africa is the only part of the world that still has fairly high birth rates. But Africa has another problem. What is it? AIDS, HIV/AIDS. It also has other endemic diseases like malaria, typhus, typhoid, which also kill millions of people each year. And so there are still people who say, well, birth rates are still high in Africa. We need to abort and sterilize and contracept the African continent. In fact, that's what the current administration is doing right now in Kenya. Kenya is considering the passage of a new constitution which would legalize abortion. Now, the vote is August 4th. My good friend, Congressman Christopher Smith, who is probably a Catholic pro-lifer from New Jersey, some of you here know him, has recently gotten information from the United States Agency for International Development that we have spent $23 million of our money to try to convince the Kenyan people to legalize abortion. There's a law against it. There's a law against it. It's called the Silander Amendment, which forbids the use of U.S. funds to lobby for the legalization of abortion or performance of abortion overseas. The law is being violated right now. It should be up to the Kenyan people to decide democratically whether or not they want to protect the sanctity of life or whether they want to legalize abortion. One of the things we in the United States are supposed to be doing around the world is promoting democracy. How can we claim to be promoting democracy on the one hand when we are funding a propaganda campaign on the other that would legalize abortion against what I believe to be the wishes of the majority of the Kenyan people? So that is Africa. In Africa, I tell people in the population control movement, if you're worried about high birth rates in Africa, help African infants and children survive. Fund primary health care programs. Reduce deaths from amoebic dysentery. Reduce deaths from preventable childhood diseases. Because everywhere in the world, it has been the case that as infant and child mortality rates fall, and more children survive to adulthood, the birth rate falls naturally. You see, that's what happened throughout the world in the demographic transition. That's what happened in the United States and in Europe and in Japan. As the death rates began to fall, people began to realize they no longer needed to have 8 or 9 children like the Moshers in order to have 2 or 3 survive to adulthood. And so they naturally reduced the number of children they had. So if you're concerned, I tell them, about Africa, don't force African women not to have children. Don't try to convince Filipino women not to have children. Help with primary health care, help reduce the infant and child mortality rate, and the birth rate will come down naturally without coercion. For the most part, they're not listening. Let's go on to the next slide. We'll just, I just want to point out that, again, that Africa is the only continent where you see nations still averaging 5 or 6 children. But in those nations, you also find very high infant and child mortality rates. Let's go on to the next slide. We can go on to the next slide now. Fertility decline by regions. Again, let's not take the time to go through this in detail. The point is made in the first line, which is world fertility rates. 5 children, global average, 1950 to 55. 4.5 children, 1970. 2, and a little more than a half in 2000. And by the time we get to 2045, we're going to see a worldwide average of about 1.54. Again, population will be declining. Let's go on to the next slide. Most Filipino newlyweds, and we can move quickly through. Next slide. Have only 2 or 3 children. The Philippines has a fertility rate that is already almost at replacement. The U.S. should stop promoting abortion, sterilization, and contraception in the Philippines because birth rate is already at replacement. Like the world as a whole, the population of the Philippines will probably level off soon and then decline. And I believe that we don't need fewer Filipinos, we need more Filipinos. We are, everywhere I go in the world and get involved in pro-life movements, I often find immigrants from the Philippines active there, active in Hong Kong, active in Singapore, active in other parts of the world. And I believe that you all have been great, that the Filipinos and Filipino Americans are great evangelists, as Pope John Paul II pointed out. And if there's one thing we need, it's more evangelization. And let's go on to when someone tells you the world is overpopulated, tell them to relax. If someone tells you the Philippines is overpopulated, tell them again to relax. The Philippines population will never double again. Now, if we had time, I would go through the reasons by population control makes no sense. The other side